Hello there, it's Paul here and welcome everyone. If you follow me on social media, especially on Instagram and Facebook, you may have seen recently on a lot of my storylines that I've been doing is that I mentioned something called Brusho colours. These are from a company in the UK called Colourcraft. These tubs contain 15 grams of little crystals which are dissolved in water. The entire range there is just over 30 colours, and so far I've bought 7 of the colours to trial to see what they're like. Now the cost of these is extremely cheap. They're just under £2 per one of these tubs. On social media I posted a picture which I'll show on the side here of a little spinning top that I did, and I used this cobalt blue on it, and all I did for the application there was put it on via brush. I'm going to mix up all the colours I've got, and the idea is then as I want to see how they go on with an airbrush, and I also want to see how they go on with the method via paper towel. As I mentioned, I've bought 7 of these colours. So I've got the cobalt blue, I've got an orange, a lemon, turquoise, black, violet and brilliant red. I'm going to mix these up in these little 250ml bottles, and what I've done so far is I've filled them all literally to the neck there. Last night I came out into the shed and I did actually mix up a couple of the colours. So I've got the cobalt blue in there, and as you can see it's quite a nice consistency there. It's not see-through or anything like that. All I did was put in that 250ml of water just half a gram of these crystals. Second colour I did was the brilliant red. Now hopefully you can see a difference on here. This looks a bit more translucent. It might also be a case that I have to play around with sort of like how much of the crystals you put in, but for my initial tests I'm going to mix these all up in exactly the same way. All the tubs come sealed, so this time I'm going for the violet, and I've got my bottle of water ready, and I'm just going to use my small digital scales here. And the way I'm doing this, so hopefully you can now see, there is the crystals, and they are really fine. So the way I do this is with my scales. As you can see, with the tub on there, it's 17.4 grams. So I'll just reset that. And I'm just using a lollipop stick here. And the idea is I want to try and pull out about half a gram. So that's 0.4. I'll just drop that in there for starters. So that's now 0.5 gone in there. And hopefully you can see it's already dissolved fairly well in there, but to make sure it dissolves properly, make sure the lid's on fully tight so that no air can leak out. All the colours have been mixed up. Now the only odd one was this turquoise one, was that the crystals weren't so fine as what you probably see when I did the first one. The crystals on this were actually a lot bigger. It was like there was a 2-part material there. And the first test I want to do is with the airbrush. And normally I have the pots, sealed pots underneath, but for the very first time I'm going to use this open one. So I'm going to put a little bit of black in there. On the lathe here, I've just got a piece of wood that I've turned down, and this is where I want to put the black on first. It looks like a piece of ash, and I want to get it all into the grain. First of all with the airbrush, then sand it back, and then can start doing some other colours on there. But at the moment that's coming out very watery, so that's almost like it wants a lot more colour in there. I mean, it's got a hint of like a grey in there, but it's certainly very watery at the moment. So I'm going to, what I'll do, I'm just going to mix up the colours a bit stronger in there. Now I've finally got a black colour on there, and in the end for this mix I actually had to mix up 4 grams in there. What I have noticed though is by using the airbrush it does put an awful lot of water on your work, but the effect on here is actually quite nice, and it might be a case that you probably didn't need quite so much on there in the first place. Now, I had sanded this to 400, so as well that may well also be part of why it was repelling some of the colour and leaving it as water. So I'm going to let this fully dry off first of all, and then I'm going to get this sanded back, and then I can then start trying sort of some paper towel application. This is now just about dry, and I thought I'd just show it before I sanded it all back, and it has come out a nice, quite a nice black on there. Now this has been sanded back, and you can certainly see, certainly on this side the grain has still got the black in there, whereas this side it's worn out more. Now I have sanded this from 180 through to 400. What I'm going to try now is with paper towels, and I've actually put a glove on this time to save the hands a bit. And I've got the brilliant red there, the lemon and the turquoise. I'm going to put some lemon on first of all, so just see. So that's not really showing up a great deal on there. It does have some yellow in there. Just put some random spots around. And that's obviously going to react with the black as well. Hopefully you can see it is drying up there with some yellow. I'll just leave that a moment and then try the red. So these are very sort of weak colours at the moment, and I think they're going to need a stronger dilution, but hopefully you can see on there the colours are now starting to come through. I'll just try the turquoise as well. This one might have been stronger in actual fact. See, that looks a lot brighter. So I think what I'm going to do, the turquoise looks a lot better anyway. That's certainly coming out bolder. Now I've just doubled the dilution on these, so just see whether they come out any brighter. And that is coming out brighter now. And because they're watercolours, they react with the other colours as well. There you go, look at that, that's really coming through now. And then try the turquoise again. And again, that is coming out a lot better now. The colours certainly show up well on there now. They're not deep colours, they are more a lighter colour. So I'm going to let that dry off, and then I might just hollow out the inside, and then so I can just finish the whole thing off. I've just hollowed and sanded out the inside, and I'd totally forgotten about that. It was a really shallow, small mortise on there. It did fly off the lathe a couple of times, so I've got a nice dent there and there. But these are really more of a pastel colour now that they're dried, and it'll be interesting to see what they're like when they get some form of a finish on. And normally when I use a sanding sealer, I would use, especially with colours like this where they might run, I'd use the spray sanding sealer. But I'm going to try wiping it on to see how much sort of bleed out we get off here, and sometimes that works better because if these colours bleed a little bit, it also helps blend them in. Let's just see. So as far as I can tell on there, there is no bleed out. So even though this is water based, and they are looking a lot more vivid as well now. So there's no bleed out on there whatsoever. So I'm going to get this covered in sanding sealer fully. That's now had a couple of coats of sanding sealer and just knocked back with an eye web. And I don't know how well it's showing with the on the camera there, the colours. I'll just switch off my spotlights there, and hopefully it will just show a different aspect on this. But they are very sort of pastel colours. The yellow can be quite bright in places. The red is certainly not deep. It's very pastel-y, and the turquoise is very similar as well. So yeah, it's very pastel-y. This side seems to be a lot sort of bolder with the colours, and that's also interesting because that's obviously where it's took on the grain more, so it's almost as if that side of the wood was a bit more absorbent than this side. But what I'm going to do is, when I come out in the shed next, I'm going to try and dilute make a stronger dilution, and so I'll use the blue, which we didn't use on this one. I'll use the violet and also the orange, and I'll probably give a black base again to get into the grain. And I've got another piece, the other half of what was this, to turn another one. The other colours I hadn't used, I've actually made them a lot more sort of stronger dilution. In some cases I'll put anything up to about 3 to 4 grams of the crystals in there, and even though they probably do look thicker, I don't really think they make much difference. However, here's the original one that I did, which is all, I mean, that's supposed to be brilliant red, that was the turquoise yellow, and so they're all very, very light pastel colours. However, this is the result of them, what I did with the more diluted ones, and it wasn't because I've made them a much stronger dilution. The way I've applied these differently is that I made sure there wasn't too much liquid going onto the workpiece when I did it, and let that dry. And it only takes probably a minute. So, I mean, for example, where I was going around doing the blue, I was just dabbing it on to go around with the blue. By the time I'd probably gone round, just about it was dry again. So I could then sort of like go off and do another colour or re-go over the blue. And so it's sort of a case of probably going over about 3 times. And I deliberately left the black on there so you can just see how this builds up as well. I've just turned another piece of ash here, which was wet, out of my pile. And I've sanded this to 400 grit. So I've just got the black there, and I can't remember, I think I may well have mixed that up a bit stronger as well. And I found the best way is to literally just dab on. So you can see there, this has really taken nicely in the grain. But the more I want this built up in colour, I just need to let it dry and then go over again. Now this is actually a fairly large piece to go on, so if I really want to build this up, by the time I got round to this side again, that's all going to be dry. Try not to get too much, and this is probably where it works better than an airbrush, because if you're using an airbrush you really need to have it on a really, really fine mist, whereas when I applied it on that first piece with the black, it was coming out quite a lot. That little pot I emptied quite quickly of the whole black. Now the one good thing I think this does have over really a lot of the other stains is that you've got more control over how dense you want the colour. So that's now had one coverage, and as you can see this lot has really all dried. So I'll just go over it once more. Hopefully you can see that's, I mean, that's just gone over just twice, and if I want this even darker I could then just keep building up, let it dry a little bit and then build it up. So I'm just going to give that a few minutes, and then I'll sand this back, and then what I'm going to do then is I'm going to choose one of the colours, or some of the colours that I did on the original bowl. I've let this dry fully back, and then I've sanded from 180, 240, 320 and 400 again. So it's really, really nicely held in the grain, all the black there. I'm going to use the yellow first of all. I want to see now how much we can get this sort of bright. So I'm going to probably mainly concentrate on the top area with the yellow, and then I'll use the red to go on the bottom half, or sort of like bottom 2/3. So we can see we've got that on there, and it's just going to go around dabbing it again. So we've got a very, very pale yellow on there at the moment. So I've just been around that 3 times so far, and hopefully you can see, hopefully it shows on the camera there, that it is coming up really bright. Just going to switch my main lights off just to see if that makes much difference. It does show up nice and yellow on there. After going around it 3 times, I left it to dry for probably no more than a couple of minutes, and then I've gone around it another 3 times, and hopefully you can see it's now coming up a lot brighter, especially if you compare it to like this very first original one I did. Going to start now on the bottom with the brilliant red. As we can see, it's very, very light and pastel-y, very much like the red in there. So I just need to build some up on the cloth first of all. So that's been around 3 times now, and I've got to say that looks already a lot brighter than anything I did on that first piece. I've just given this probably another 2 or 3 coats with the yellow and the red, and I've got to say they are looking super bright. That yellow especially. Red has certainly come up more. I think as it dries it will probably darken a little bit more as well, so it'll be interesting to see how that comes up. This has now been left to dry overnight, and hopefully you can see now how vivid these colours are. I mean, the yellow really comes up really nice. That was called Brilliant Red, and just look at the difference in these. The yellows to real being washed out and pastel-y, and the reds, I mean the reds on here were almost like a pink. Now I suppose the real test on this is how colour fast they are as I put some sanding sealer on. Now, if you was worried about this, you could just use spray sanding sealer, but there's a little bit of yellow coming off there. Not really the red. So there's a little bit of red on there and a little bit of yellow coming out, but not much. This has now had a couple of coats of sanding sealer, and I've actually knocked it back with an eye web, what I'd normally do. But for one final test, what I thought I'd do as well to see how sort of colour fast and everything these are, as I'll use an abrasive paste on them. I've got Yorkshire grit here. There are quite a few others available on the market. I'm going to apply this on here. When you use one of these abrasive pastes, you've got to treat it a bit like sandpaper. Start off at a low speed. If your lathe does go slower than 500, start off at something like about 300. So I've just dropped that down to about 330 there at the moment. And just gently work it in. You can hear the abrasive in the paste, sort of just slowly breaking down and working its way in. Slowly as it does its work, you can then speed it up slowly. So that's the extent there, and I can see that it's literally dried out there now. When I finish off, I'll put this lathe up to at least probably about 1000 RPM, and then just use another clean part of the cloth. So there's just small amounts of red coming off there. So that's now with an abrasive paste done, and it's still got the same sort of colour intensity. Now, I'm just using Wood Wax 22, which is a chestnut product. And that's coming up really, really nicely now. Just to summarise on everything that I've done here. First of all, I bought these small pots of 15-gram Brusho watercolour crystals by somebody called Colourcraft here in the UK. I bought these from a website called Ken Bromley Art Supplies. The link will be below. Cost on these £1.95 each. So initially I then diluted half a gram of that mixture into these 250 millilitre bottles of water. The initial tests on this piece were very, very light and pastel-y. Found with the airbrush, they're just far too watery to really achieve anything, even when you increase the dilution on them. You might find though that to use the airbrush you need to have it as a much finer mist, so that you, and smaller quantities coming out, so that you do several layers. Now when I did my second test with the second batch of colours, I actually increased the dilution on them, and the initial application was coming out just as pastel-y. And the problem with these is that the water is the prominent feature in these. I don't know how much of a mix you would need to get before you really got it so that the colour came out a lot bolder with a single application. But that's probably also a good thing, because it gives you more control over whether you want these light pastel colours that you've got straight away, or whether you want to build up to these darker colours. Now as a final test, what I did there, I took the original mixtures that I got of these, which had only been on the dilution of half a gram on the mix, and I built up the colours on this. And I found the easiest method for this was literally just dabbing it on and going over as it dried, building up more and more colours. So where those have really had probably 1 or 2 layers of application on this one has actually had probably around about 8 to 10 layers on there, and it really does bring out the boldness. Also then, as a test to see how sort of like colour fast these were, I used sanding sealer on there, but literally from a cloth rather than a spray. and there was very, very little bleed out onto the cloth. Certainly not anything to bleed the colours around with each other. And then as a final test, I then used an abrasive paste to then see what happens there as well. And again, you get a little bit of bleed out onto your cloth, but it doesn't mix into the colour. Now, if you follow my channel, I sometimes use the spirit stains from Chestnut Products. How do I compare those to those? The spirit stains are bold colours straight to start with. Both have their benefits. These, I'd say, first of all, very, very cheap. £1.95, and I mean, as I've used half a gram out of 15 grams there to mix up 250 millilitres. So that colour by rights will probably last me a lifetime, each one of these pots. There's also a range of 34 colours that you can buy on these. So there's quite a vast range if you want to go down all that route with the colours. The second benefit is that initial application, you can get these really, really light pastel colours. So if you don't want a really bright, bold colour, when you use a lot of these other colours, especially like the spirit stains, you're going to have to thin them down. Now, the only real disadvantages I can see with using these is one, yes, because they're so wet with the paper towel, you can't necessarily sort of bleed them into all the colours very easily without all your paper towel breaking up. But as I said, using a cloth, you might get over that. The second thing is airbrush. From my initial tests, it's putting an awful lot of moisture out, so how well they could be used in an airbrush, I'm not sure. You would have to really try and fine-tune your airbrush to come out as more of a very much finer spray so that there's less liquid coming out. And the other real disadvantage on these as well is that the more you throw down initially, all you're doing is putting water on your piece, which is, it doesn't increase the intensity of the colour. You've got to let the colour go on dry before you then build up further colours to then create these deeper colours. The only other disadvantage I can also see as well is that you've got to make up yourself. So you've got to go out and buy some bottles or find some containers to put them in, and you've got to sit there and mix them up. Now, I don't think these will ever replace things like the spirit stains and the other products like that, but what I do think though is that these are a good additive to your arsenal of colours if you're down the colouring route. Now, hopefully that's given you a good insight onto how these Brusho colours work, and if you've got any questions, certainly leave comments below, and if you've used these before, let me know. Let me know how you got on. It will be interesting to see if you've worked out a different way to using them compared to what I've done here, especially if you've used them in the airbrush, where my initial tests were that they just wash out very, very quickly and easily. Thanks a lot for watching.